Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Hey, thanks for joining us on American Potential. Appreciate you following the podcast and downloading the podcast. We continue to talk about some great issues. I'm at the all-staff retreat for Americans for Prosperity, and always amazed, as I said in a previous podcast, always amazed at the number of people here and the great work that Americans for Prosperity is doing around the country. You know, I want to talk about the presidential election because the calendar may say 2023, but people are thinking about 2024. And we have these presidential elections, and we always hear, for people who live in states that aren't some of the major states, it almost seems like we're forgotten. I live in one of those, Colorado. But if you live in some of these major states, this is all you hear about is the presidential race. And we have, of course, New Hampshire is the second state to go, but the first primary. The first caucus state is the state of Iowa, followed by New Hampshire, the first primary state, and then South Carolina, that is the first southern state to have their voice heard. And on today's podcast, we have three great guests, Americans for Prosperity state directors from three of these early primary states. The state director of Iowa, Drew Klein, state director of New Hampshire, Greg Moore, and the state director from South Carolina, Candace Carroll. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
Yeah, so I'll start with you. When people think about New Hampshire, they think about, kind of a smaller state. It's kind of an intimate setting politically, but I don't think people really understand how intimate it really is, right? Give us a sense of that. What's it like living in New Hampshire during a presidential election?
A lot of the intensity, it just gets ramped up, and it's particularly true between the periods of Iowa and New Hampshire, but all these candidates are around, and there's a common joke where they ask somebody, who are you voting for this certain candidate? And they'll say, well, I don't know. I've only met him twice. And so we really are a particularly spoiled subset of voters. The nature of the primary versus the caucus is different, whereas I think Iowa has far and away the most spoiled activists. But New Hampshire has the most spoiled voters because we get so much retail politics. We have so much direct access to these candidates that you see them everywhere. And whenever there's a major political event, it's not a shock to see half a dozen presidential candidates there. And you have a chance to sit and talk and have a conversation with each one of them. So you really can take your measure of them. And New Hampshire's really good at kicking tires. We've gotten really good through the years at identifying those folks who have a lot of talent and a lot of potential. But the other aspect is that New Hampshire is an open primary. So even people who aren't registered in a political party can jump in and vote in either the Republican or Democrat presidential contests that day and make that decision. So to be appealing in New Hampshire, not only do you have to appeal to the party's base, but if you really want to be successful, you have to appeal to the base as well as a little bit to the middle as well. And I think that sort of differentiates ourselves from the very different dynamics of a caucus in Iowa.
Yeah, I have so many questions that are running through my head about so many things in New Hampshire, in all of these states. Let's talk, Drew, I want to ask you, though, the difference between a caucus and a primary, because Iowa is the first in the nation, first caucus to go. And tell folks what's the difference between a primary and a caucus.
Yeah, there's a lot of difference. I think, when you think of primaries, you think of, well, it's just just like a general election, except earlier in the calendar year, you show up and you cast a ballot. Caucuses are very different, and admittedly, the caucuses on the Democrat side are even more. I don't mean this disparagingly, but more bizarre than on the Republican side. But these are you got to show up in person at a given time on a given day. There's no absentee voting. There's no early voting. There's no you got to be there. You got to show up. And so as a result of that, to Greg's point, you really are catering to the most active portion of the base of those parties. And we won't get into all of the math and procedure on the Democrat side, but on the Republican side, you show up, you sit in, maybe you're in a church basement or a school gymnasium or in rural parts of the state. Sometimes you're literally in your neighbor's living room. And this is a function of the party itself. And as a result of just the type of setting, it really lends itself to being kind of a community activity. Nobody really shows up and participates in the caucus as a standalone free agent. They do it because their neighbors are doing it, or it's a family tradition, or their church group is heavily active and their church drives them, but they are part of a larger civic organization of some sort, whether that's, like I said, family, church, neighborhood. And so you really get these blocks of people participating in the caucuses because of that.
Yeah. By the way, I think you're going to be the first state director to be on 2 podcast episodes. You're chasing, you and Jesse Mallory are fighting for it, but I am taking bribes. So just whatever you want to.
All right. Well,
we'll make sure you air first.
Come on out to Iowa. I've got some special guests to introduce you to.
I'll bet. They all want to be on the podcast.
Lots of corn.
That's right. And Candace, South Carolina, how did South Carolina become, number one, so important, but how did it become the first in the South?
Yeah, actually,
primary?
so we've been the first in the South and have fought for that since the 1980s. This is something that South Carolina has taken a lot of pride in and fought for that space, especially on the Republican side. And this year will be the first time the Democrat side has said, like, we want to be first, not just in the South, but in the nation, too, for the Democratic primary. And similar to New Hampshire, we have open primaries as well. So folks can vote in either one. You can just one, but either one. What I think is so important about South Carolina is the road to the presidency has to come through South Carolina. I don't know about these guys, but we are known for picking the president. Traditionally, whoever wins South Carolina is who ends up winning, especially the Republican nomination. Mm-hmm. And so, coming from, looking at things that happened in New Hampshire, looking at things that happened in Iowa, the candidate who was able to walk out of South Carolina and have all of the other candidates start to drop out of the race. At that point, they pick up a lot of momentum. And so you've got to be able in South Carolina to appeal to folks who are on the far conservative right, a lot of folks who are evangelicals who live in one side of the state, to more moderate folks who live down in Charleston. And so you've got to be able to appeal to both of those bases when you're coming in and you're talking about, whatever your policies are for the country and how you envision, our America running. What I think, too, is important is knowing that similar to New Hampshire, it's a very intimate setting. We see presidential candidates all the time. We have 2 of our own running from South Carolina this year, which is unique in that, they're there all the time. And so, having that opportunity to have folks come in, sit down with you, not just go to these big conventions, but you see them in your local coffee shops. You see them, grabbing lunch with someone. And so being able to have that intimate setting with them, learn what they're about, especially this year where like I mentioned, we've got 2 of our own, right? So people have looked at their voting records, both, from being in the Senate, from being governor, and they're taking that into account as to what they want to happen next year in 2024.
Yeah. And South Carolina, even for the Democrats, it was the critical state.
Critical state all the way around, yes. And so, we really, look at the candidate who can carry the African American vote, who can carry the suburban mom vote, who can carry we have a good voter base mix. And so you've got to be able to appeal to all of that and then carry that out.
Yeah, right. So, Greg, tell me, you talked about the intimacy of this in New Hampshire. I only met him twice. That's a great saying. I'm sure everybody in New Hampshire knows that saying, right?
Absolutely. that and Iowa picks corn and New Hampshire picks president.
Okay, there you go. You get a chance to rebut. In just
I'll wait.
Yeah, I'll wait. Okay, Greg. So give me an example of that. Tell me a story. You walk into a diner in the middle of this, and we've seen it on TV where you'll be eating in a diner and a presidential candidate just walk through and start shaking hands.
I'll give an example from just recently. I actually went to a diner where I knew that Governor DeSantis was going to be attending. So I said, and I'm a political junkie. I go to all these candidates' events. And sure enough, I was there, and there's some more other political junkie diehards who had some advance notice that the governor was going to be there. There were also tons of people who were just there having lunch.
Yeah.
And they were just eating lunch. And all of a sudden, the governor of Florida shows up and is shaking your hand. So, but that's a really traditional thing to happen in New Hampshire where the diner tours are really common, where they get out and try to connect directly with folks in these diners. It's not so much large events. It really isn't a case where there's many times we have something like 5,000 people get together. That's very uncommon. it really is, how do you work small group settings, house parties of 25 people, town hall meetings of 50 people, and then these intimate diner settings. And because of that, it's not just your policies, but your personality comes through, and people can start to actually win over votes because they get this strong direct connection with these folks. And it's usually over the course of a month. And what you'll see is the successful candidates in New Hampshire, you'll see they'll show up, they'll be fairly well known, but not particularly well known. And in the first round, they'll have 25 people at their town hall meeting. And then the buzz will start in that area. And then they'll come back to that same area and it'll be 50 people. And then if something really catches fire, there'll be 100 people. And so you can physically watch that momentum growing, which you maybe don't get watching a national newscast or some of the Super Tuesday states who don't get this type of retail politics. You can't physically see that type of
or they shrink. Something goes bad in a campaign and you start
there's another
seeing
market
people.
signal.
That's right. How about you, Drew? We talked about the fairs. I know the state fair and things like that. Candidates must be swarming those.
Yeah, you've got state fairs and county fairs. I mean, literally any collection of people is a justification for a candidate to show up and shake hands and introduce themselves. But it's actually very similar to New Hampshire in that sense. This is going to be a process that takes place over several visits. Nobody is committing on their first date with a candidate. In fact, we had some of our staffers just a couple of weeks ago that got to play tennis with a presidential candidate in the state of Iowa. Now, not for very long, and that candidate's very good at tennis, turns out. But yeah, you get all of these interesting opportunities to interact with, and it doesn't it doesn't feel like you would think the presidential process plays out. It's not just to sit there and grill you on your policies and stuff like that. Like we want to know where you want to take the country, but we also want to know who's driving the bus. Who are you as a person? What do you value? What are you what's your backstory? What's your family look like? What's all of those things? And so you see these people, pop up in diners and, they run ragged through the state of Iowa. But I've been sitting in a church service on a Sunday morning and a presidential candidate just kind of walks in and sits down. And oftentimes they're just there. I mean, they're living in Iowa, so they show up for church Sunday morning like they would if they were back in their home state, and take a seat in the back of the church and go about their Sunday mornings. I mean, it is literally everywhere. You'll run into them in the grocery store, and again, anywhere where people are congregating, you're going to find presidential candidates hanging out as well.
Right. How about a story? Do you have a story like Greg? Like what's the one, like the story you remember most of a presidential candidate?
I remember back in, there's a lot of them. I remember in 2016, we had a field staffer that had come to Iowa to work for us, but he had come from Montana. And so had never been exposed to presidential candidates this way. And he called me one day and he was really excited that he got to meet Senator Rick Santorum at this coffee shop. He's like, there were only 10 people there. And I got to shake his hand and introduce myself and talk to him and all of those things. And I was like, yeah, that's really cool. Now what I need you to do is I need you to go to the drugstore and I need you to buy a pair of toenail clippers. Just keep them in your pocket. And next time you see a presidential candidate, take your socks and shoes off and hand them the toenail clippers, because in Iowa, they have to clip your toenails if that's what you ask them to do. Like they're trying to win your vote. But people are just blown away. You get people, there is like this aspect of political tourism, and especially like the young politicos that move to Iowa for the employment opportunities are just blown away at how accessible these people are. And it's not, we think of these like big planned out events where like we know where we're going to be a month in advance. And so we're recruiting all the people and we're doing all those things. In Iowa, these are pop-up events. I mean, DeSantis did a pop-up event, just kind of fly by night. It was an event that was built on 3 hours notice and had, 200 people show up. We're just wired to show up. And again, it's not fandom. It's not that we're showing up to because we're enthralled with politicians. That's our opportunity to grill them and ask them tough questions. And you do get some really tough questions that are thrown at candidates in these settings, and not necessarily the ones that you would think. They come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah. Candace, I was going to ask you about surrogates, but before I do that, I want to ask you about your story. I'm sure you have a story too that you remember of an interaction with a presidential candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very similar on the diner situation. So there are certain diners, one in particular that comes to mind in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where presidential candidates, every single one has hit that diner. And you can walk in there and see all of the pictures from every single like stop that has been made there with the diner owner, with the cooks hanging on the wall. And so it's one of those, like, if you were not hitting that diner, then like that's a missed opportunity on your part because everyone else before you has.
Sure.
And yeah, it's the same. I mean, you walk into a coffee shop, right? And they're coming in there. And I remember back in the 2016 election, just having lunch, and it's like, and here comes in, Jeb Bush just walks in, it's like grabbing lunch, it's like, oh, I got to run, kind of thing. And it's like, you're these very minor things of like, they want to be accessible. People know that they're there today. And then you see these candidates that are walking in and it's just for these very minor things of like, they want to be accessible. People know that they're there. And similarly to what Drew said, it's not the fandom, but it's what South Carolinians now have come to expect of, all of the local, I would even say like Chamber of Commerce meetings now. Like there's going to be a presidential candidate there. They're going to be at everything from here on out, our state fair, a variety of things. And so being able to lean into those opportunities to meet them, to shake their hand, to get to know who they really are is important for South Carolinians.
So, but for political junkies, this has to be fun. I mean, I'm sure for the three of you, this is a great time of the cycle, right?
If you're, and it's not just true of us, all of our activists, they love this stuff. Yeah. They love this stuff, and they really want to be part of the process. And a lot of it is helping them get access, and just because we tend to have a lot of information that flows through us, and so we can share that information with our activists, and they love it. They really get excited about it. I know our activists in New Hampshire always say, "Well, I want to know next time Senator Tim Scott's going to be in state. Can you let me know when that is?" And so a lot of it is just for us is connecting the access points to the activists who want to get engaged. I will say that one of the things that AFP gives us a great opportunity to do is because these candidates know AFP's grassroots strength. They want to build relationships with us. And because they know we have the grassroots connections that can help them along the way, and we're happy to do it as a service to our activists. We just our activists love this stuff. They love politics as much as we do. Again, the activists in Iowa probably take the cake as far as the most spoiled activists. We'll take the cake for the most spoiled voters. So it really is. And we just, I don't know how you can live in Iowa and New Hampshire and not just love everything about the process if you like politics.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to ask about surrogates, and I'll ask each of you that. But Candace, Joe Biden got the nomination really through South Carolina last time. James Clyburn was critical to endorsing him, and everything sort of fell in place after that for him. How critical are those endorsements? And particularly with South Carolina in the Republican primary this year, you've got, your former governor, you've got a U.S. senator from South Carolina, both of those running. How do surrogates play into that?
Oh, it's huge. It's a very crucial part of the process. And so we have seen, of course, Jim Clyburn, that became the linchpin and what really became the catalyst for Biden becoming president. And we see that same thing now. So, of course, like when candidates start announcing, there are already surrogates who are lining up behind them. Of course, Tim Scott just announced earlier this week, there were a number of state elected officials there who were already saying, like, I'm in for Tim. We saw the same thing for Governor Haley when she announced. We've seen the same thing for President Trump when he announced. It is one of those things where they start lining up those folks early on because they are the trusted messengers in their communities. And so when these presidential candidates, of course, they try to be everywhere. Their campaign team tries to be everywhere. But the elected officials and those local community leaders are the trusted ones that are there, and they're going to be at every local breakfast if someone can't, right? And so being able to have that elected official or that community leader, that pastor, a lot of times, especially in our really rural communities that welcomes these folks into their churches, they become such a crucial part of this nomination process because that's who people are looking to determine, like, well, I really align with this person and this person has done great work at the State House. So, like, they must be solidly picking who they want to become president.
Sure. Well, and you even have Lindsey Graham.
We do.
Right?
Yeah.
Who it plays pretty big in Republican politics.
He does. Yeah. And so we see a lot of that. And as Greg mentioned, though, like our activists are hungry for this access too.
Sure.
And so we actually share, we share that information with them of saying, hey, there's this local county meeting coming up or this local chamber meeting coming up. This person will be there or that person will be there. Like, go attend, especially if these like free events, because people want to be able to ask them questions.
Right.
And I think what's cool too is we then get to help plant questions in the audience. So we have done that before for this presidential engagement. We've done it before for previous primary engagements in the state, where we will get one of our activists, because people see us all the time. They're like, I'm not going to answer Candace's question, right? Like I see her all the time. But we'll have activists who we can hand a question to, and they will try to get that question asked. So then we get someone on the record answering something as to like, how are they aligned with AFP or not on a certain issue. And so that I think is really cool too, because then you have activists who are helping to drive that narrative across the state aligned with AFP's policies.
Right. And you all have surrogates as well, right? Your governors, your senators, and who they end up aligning with. That's a big deal. They will at times attach themselves to a candidate and go with them around the state. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a big deal, Drew.
Yeah, I mean, Governor Reynolds has been campaigning with all of them. I mean, has helped introduce them and welcome them to the state of Iowa. And I don't know what her long-term plans are, but yeah, you'll have elected officials that decide to make endorsements. Now, I think we oftentimes kind of take a wait and see approach. It's a long road from now to the caucuses, and so people again they want to really get a sense of every aspect of the candidate, not least of which is their work ethic, their ability to come put in the work and put in the miles around the state. But yeah, I mean, across the board, our elected leaders want to showcase Iowa to these folks that are coming and visiting, and they want to paint Iowa in the best light possible, for sure. But it's not just those elected officials. It's, other, right now in the Republican process, you have all of these center-right or conservative influencers that are doing the exact same thing. And that's everything from, like I said, the governor of the state of Iowa to maybe the leader of some, patriot group in rural Iowa. All of them are doing this. They're welcoming folks in. So it's every Republican county central committee is hosting, a chili supper or whatever it is. We're not at sweet corn season yet, but eventually you get into the sweet corn festivals, and that's maybe the best time to be in Iowa. You've got all of these small events happening, and influencers in their own rights in their own communities that are going to play a role. And like I said, I mean, these caucuses are driven by community. And so an influencer over a community of 20, 30, 40 people, that's a political power broker in the state of Iowa. And it really comes down to that work ethic. Are you going to go out and earn the vote and the support of each of those small communities around the state? Because that's the road to winning the caucuses.
Yeah. You don't have sweet corn festivals in New Hampshire?
I think it's more like seafood festivals.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, listen, here's what I'm going to do. I want to do a podcast episode on Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. So I'd like to have each of you come back. We'll just do a whole episode on your state, just kind of talk about what you're hearing, all that kind of stuff. Would y'all go a game for that? Yeah.
So I'll be Jesse Mallory to the second, and then you'll give me a third?
No, I'm going to give you a third before Jesse. How's that? Does that sound good?
That's great. I'm on.
Good.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Okay, well, we'll do it. This is exciting stuff. It's fun for other people around the country who don't live this stuff and live in these states that get all of this primary attention. If you're from Alaska, they're like, what are they talking about? Hawaii? What presidential candidate goes all the way to Hawaii to get, 3 electoral votes or whatever they have? So this is an interesting process. These folks are experts on this. They're experts on their states, and we're going to have them come back. But, hey, thank you for listening to American Potential. Follow us on YouTube, if you will. All of these are now posted on YouTube. That's a great way to watch the podcast, but you can also find us on any podcast platform. We do essentially 3 podcast episodes a week, and the podcast is growing at a great pace. So thank you for that. We appreciate you listening. We'll be back next time with another edition of American Potential.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.